Welcome to Adventures of a Bystander. Today I have the immense pleasure of hosting Dr. Bryan Caplan, a renowned economist, author, and all round fascinating individual. Dr. Caplan is well known for his work challenging conventional wisdom on topics like education, parenting, and open borders. His books, including The Case Against Education, Build Baby Build, have sparked important debates and prompted many to rethink long held assumptions. In this conversation, we'll explore Dr. Caplan's intellectual journey from his childhood fascination with fantasy, Dungeons and Dragons, to his current work as a leading public intellectual. We'll discuss provocative views on education, the role of signaling in society, and the importance of nonconformism in academia. So, sit back, relax, and get ready for an engaging discussion with the inimitable Dr. Bryan Caplan. Dr. Caplan, welcome to the show.
Fantastic to be here, Pranchal.
Okay, so the last time you were at UT Students' first early podcast, that podcast turned out to be Dwarkesh's podcast. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping it sort of takes the same trajectory and we go places from here.
All right, yeah, fantastic. And if Dwarkesh is watching, good job, buddy.
Perfect. All right. So, Dr. Caplan, let me begin by, essentially referring back to the first time we met. When we were in Austin, we were grabbing lunch, and when the staff asked to take a picture of ours, you mentioned something offhand that the 15-year-old Bryan would be really surprised if I told him that this is how he's living his life, right? So that takes me to my first question. Like, take me back to the 15-year-old Bryan. Like, what were you thinking about as a child? What were your aspirations? Just take me back to that time.
Honestly, the main thing I thought about was Dungeons and Dragons. I had created a giant fictional world. I had a game that I was running for all of my closest friends every Saturday night. In most of my spare time, I was just working on that game. I had some notion that I wanted to be an English professor one day. That had been my interest for a long time. I liked making stories. The dream of becoming like the next J.R.R. Tolkien was one that was definitely on my mind. Yeah. I realized that was really unlikely. So I was never totally crazy about how easy it was to become a star. But I had the idea, well, be an English professor, and that will be my fallback plan. I did not understand how hard it is to get that job, even back in those days, never mind today.
Yeah.
But that's basically what I was spending my time on, and just reading lots of fantasy. I didn't know anything about economics, nothing about philosophy. It was mostly just focused on this game and anything related to fantasy. That was what I thought about.
Amazing. So exercising those creative muscles right from your childhood, where did this shift from a kid who loves to reading fantasy, loves Dungeons and Dragons? How does the shift occur when you start getting into economics and math and all that stuff?
Yes. So what happened was I was in 11th grade when a friend of mine was reading Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, and he told me that I would really like it, and he gave me Francisco d'Anconia's Speech on Money, and I thought, oh, that's pretty good, but I didn't immediately read the book. But just a couple of days before 12th grade started, I did. And then I had that classic hysterical reaction where I couldn't put the book down. I'm like, oh my God. And I read the book in 3 days. Yeah. And then after that, the question in my mind was, I've never heard anyone say this kind of thing before, that it would be better to have free markets without government regulation.
Sure.
I've always been taught this would be a total disaster. So what do other people say? And from there, I started reading the economists that she recommended. She's a big fan, of course, of Ludwig von Mises and Henry Hazlitt. And through them, I found other Austrian economists. And that's mostly what I read in high school. And I just learned Austrian economics and free market economics more generally. And it wasn't really until I was in college that I learned what I'll call real economics, where I said, okay, so there's definitely some other people with something to say about this. And I learned that stuff too. And then spent years thinking about it. Also along the time I was reading a lot of philosophy too. In terms, the economics was really like, is what Ayn Rand's talking about even possible? Wouldn't it just be a total social meltdown?
Yeah.
And I would say that very quickly reading economics and philosophy and related subjects almost totally absorbed all the time that I used to spend on fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons. No doubt critics will say you switch from one fantasy to another, but at least on the surface, there was a difference.
Okay. Amazing. I think you mentioned Henry Hazlitt. Henry Hazlitt's economics in one lesson was like one of the primary TIL moments for me when I read it back in school. So particularly for Ayn Rand, like today when you see people look at Ayn Rand, do you see there was any nuance lacking in Ayn Rand's philosophy, or do you think Ayn Rand, what she thought about in terms of free markets, could be actively implemented in toto?
Well, there's tons of nuance that she had no clue about.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that what she was talking about couldn't be implemented in total.
Of course.
I mean, like a lot of what you need to understand is like, I mean, she's very similar to the Austrian economists in just ruling out a lot of complaints by definition. And so that ultimately, I think, is a very weak response.
Yeah.
And then, combined with a lot of tautologies of saying, well, like in a free market, you wouldn't be able to pollute. Okay. Or something, that's more Murray Rothbard, but nevertheless, the idea of, well, pollution crosses property lines, property sacrosanct, therefore you can't do it. Yeah. It would be that kind of idea where it's like, don't we just pollute on each other by breathing? That would be one small subtlety. I'd never consented to be breathed upon.
Sure.
And yet, based upon the science, molecules are being spat at me all the time by other people.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of her arguments, yeah, sure. The claim that so simplistic is a appropriate adjective for a lot of the things that she said. Of course, also appropriate for almost all of her critics do. Hardly any of them really understand what's really going on. I mean, I'd say, in terms of understanding basic economics, there is the textbook, which I think is deeply insightful if you read it literally. It's normally combined with a big political agenda, which is terrible.
Yeah. No,
the way that I think about it is this. So the whole idea in the textbook really comes down to this Pigovian idea from Arthur Pigou. That's the adjectival form of the name Pigou is Pigovian, that things with positive externalities are underprovided, and that there's that the natural government policy to correct this would be a subsidy. Things with negative externalities are overrided. The natural government policy is a tax. And then to look at the real world and say that actually governments almost never do either of these things. Governments almost never subsidize things with positive externalities. Instead, they love to use it as an excuse for government takeover of the industry. Also, governments very rarely tax things with negative externalities. Instead, they use it as an excuse to ban or print up a phone book of regulation. Now, and then there's a lot of economists who know all this. They write the textbook and then they say, government as we know it is roughly what the textbook recommends. Like, no, it's not remotely close to what the textbook recommends. The textbook says privatize everything, get rid of all the regulation, replace it with subsidies and taxes, which no country on earth does.
Now, coming to your point about government essentially entering a field and not really subsidizing the good ideas, we'll get to that when we start talking about education, because I feel there's a connect there. When I was listening to your, again, this 15-year-old Bryan who really loves fantasy, then starts understanding economic history and gets into economics, I was also reminded of this piece you wrote about your mother. It's a super moving piece where something which sort of jumps to the reader in that whole elegy is the fact that she was a nonconformist. And you make that point that her nonconformism affected you as well. Could you talk to us a bit about how were you like as a child? Were you always appreciative of your mother's nonconformism? When did you start getting an appreciation of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have this other book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, that says that most of the reason why kids resemble their parents isn't upbringing at all, but it's rather genetics.
Yeah.
So if someone has a nonconformist personality, they are greater than average to pass that nonconformist personality onto their child through a genetic channel. If you're put up for adoption, you still probably have about the same personality. I mean, I'd say about my mom is that, in hindsight, I now understand there's a nonconformist, but she was not someone who said, "Oh, do whatever you want." She was someone who's like, "Do what I want."
Yeah, sure.
She was not a live and let live person. She was, for want of a better word, she was a controlling person.
Oh.
She had her own weird ideas, and if you didn't go along with her weird ideas, she was not happy and would try to push and control.
Sure.
Now, this is, I think, a nice illustration of what I'm talking about, because if the channel was environmental, then you think that I would actually be a submissive person because I was raised by a dominant nonconformist, and then I would have learned to go and submit to other people. But instead, I say that really what happened was there was the genetic transmission, and when you get two nonconformists who disagree, you actually get conflict. So yeah, I had a ton of conflict with my mom growing up, where she would go and say, we have to do things her weird way. And I know we have to do it my weird way, which is a different way of doing things. So that's the way that I would think about my relationship with her. And honestly, at the time, like, I did not think of her as a nonconformist so much as this is my mom who wants these things that I disagree with. And it's only when I got some perspective of saying, oh yeah, she actually did go and live her life in a very unusual way for her time. She didn't get married until she was about 30, even though back when she was a young woman, the median age of marriage would have been 20. She went and traveled the world. She went from living in a suburb of Boston to working in Japan and Korea in the 1950s. So she just did a lot of things that were very nonconformist by the context of her time. But I don't think that she turned me into a nonconformist. Instead, I think that you got the kind of result that my book predicts, where put two nonconformists together and they're in conflict, of course, because they each don't want to conform to the other.
Sure. So in general, do you think the way your parents were, your mother was, that has also affected the way you parent your children?
In the main way that it's happened is negatively. There's a lot of things that my parents did that I remember at the time really disagreeing with. And I thought, I will never treat my kids the same way. And they said, oh, when you're a parent, you'll understand.
There you go.
And
yeah.
Guess what? When I became a parent, I understand even less. So for example, like, both of my parents had bad tempers. They never hit us or anything. Or like, there was a few spankings, but there's no physical abuse. But screaming over minor things was a standard kind of behavior for my parents. And like, as a child, I just thought this was a horrible way to behave. And I have made a point of not treating anyone that way, but especially my own children, who I totally love. Similarly, my parents would often have angry arguments in front of us, and I would never do that to my children. Okay. So this is the kind of thing where I think it is more plausibly environmental, just because I'm actually, rather than copying my parents, I'm doing something very different from what they did, because it seemed like a bad idea to me at the time. And with the benefit of hindsight, it seems like a really bad idea. What were they thinking? Why did they have to have a giant fight on every vacation?
Fair enough.
Why take your kids on vacation? I thought it was to give them good memories. My childhood vacation memories are terrible because they were just at each other's throats the whole time. Do that to my children? Terrible.
Oh, no, fair enough. So I think the reason I brought up the nonconformism, you mentioned that you're not really a nonconformist, but I feel like in a lot of ways, compared to the academic tribe, you have a lot of opinions which I feel might go in stark opposition to what the mainstream might think, right? So I think it's a good segue to get into the way I discovered you for the first time, right during the end of my undergraduate years. That's when I discovered the case against education. Of course, it's named very provocatively, and it's I mean, think of what you will. After 4 years of undergrad, reading a book which says why education is a complete waste of time, it sort of throws you off a little bit. So
yes. Notice the subtitle. Subtitle is why the education system is a waste of time and money.
Correct.
The thesis is not that it's a bad idea for the individual; it's a bad thing for society to subsidize.
Yes, fair enough. So I'm guessing the book sort of came out in 2019. Now it's been on in 2018. It's almost been 6 years now. How have you seen things change at the macro and micro level?
The really big shock for me was how the schools were shut down for COVID. I'm still stunned that would happen. Like, but they shut down the schools for a week or two. It's all right, fine. But the way that they stayed closed for years in some places, I just cannot believe that really happened. And it did actually change my mind about public versus private education, especially for K-12. Because when I was writing the book, I had really come to the view of there's barely even any difference between public and private K-12. If the curriculum is very similar, I didn't see that there was much difference in test scores. And then it took COVID for me to realize, well, there's one big difference. Private schools reopened basically the day that it was legal to do so, almost all over the country, with a few exceptions. And public schools, on the other hand, stayed closed as long as the teachers' unions could keep them closed. So that contrast, and then remembering, oh yeah, well, schools do provide one absolutely useful service, which is daycare. So I'd say the private sector did a way better job on daycare than the public sector. So that's something that I really did notice. Something else, when I wrote The Case Against Education, I do have a section there on the influence of education on people's political views. And what I said then was, I think still accurate based upon the data that was available, is that there's little sign that education as it actually exists really does in fact make people more left-wing. In fact, so like using all the US data that we had, the result was rather that seemed to make people a little more Republican and a little more left-wing. So both things.
Okay. Perfect. And in general,
sorry, but anyway, just to finish up that thought, what I realized since, or what I at least I have reconsidered, I'd say that the level of political brainwashing in school has gotten to be so high that past evidence is probably not a good indicator of the present actual brainwashing power of school. And the main specific fact that really changed my mind is that there's a bunch of concepts that were definitely created in academia, things like intersectionality, which as long as I was in an academia, I'm like, well, this is an idea that would only appeal to PhDs and will never have any broader cultural impact. And then normal people started talking about it. And I was like, oh my God, what? Normal people are using this bizarre academic lingo. And that's where I said, look, I don't think you can say anything other than it spread from universities and wound up changing people's minds to that degree. So I think that's another thing I did change my mind on in the last 6 years, or really more like the last 8 years, because the actual writing ended about 2 years before the book was published.
And in general, like when you talk of universities having, I think world over, universities have had a sort of a slightly more left-leaning ideological bent. The military and the police services have always been a slightly more right-leaning. Do you feel like this is also a broader point about how ideas sort of find their ways into the mainstream? The whole conception of a university being politically neutral, do you think that's even a remote possibility, or like universities will always have a left-leaning ideological bend, and you've just got to sort of take it as it will when you're getting enrolled in one?
Right. So always is such a strong word that I'll back away from that. So yeah, like in 1,000 years, will universities still be left wing? Lord only knows what's going to be happening in 1,000 years. The change of society and not just technology has gotten so fast. Things that I would have just thought were absurd have happened. So I'm like, oh my God. But in terms of what is likely to happen in the near term, so definitely I think that universities are going to stay more left-wing, and in fact will generally become more so, because we know what the age pattern of ideology looks like. And we know that young professors are even more left-wing than old professors. We know that people hardly ever change their political views as they get older. And therefore, in the medium term, the less leftist professors are going to die and retire and be replaced with a new generation that's even more so. The main thing that complicates the story is that federalism has gotten more important in the United States since COVID. There has been a greater divergence of what's happening in the 50 US states than existed before. So I would say that in very red states, I think they actually are moving their universities in an anti-woke direction, both just by doing things like getting rid of DEI, but also making threats about funding and things like that. Right. And then on top of it, I think it is actually getting a little bit harder for left-wing universities in very red states to go and attract left-wing faculty. So while there is a supply problem, there just aren't that many faculty who aren't left-wing, still, insofar as there is some mobility going on, it's just it is harder for red states to go and staff their schools with people that are as reliably left-wing. So I think that's something that's happening too. There's also some very mild move to come up with new centers of intellectual diversity on campus. Right. And again, this is especially for public schools, ironically. Public schools are the ones that are actually responsive to taxpayers and voters to some moderate degree. Private schools, especially the rich ones, they just are sitting on this giant pile of money that allows them to give the middle finger to to non-left society for centuries if they play their cards right.
No, makes complete sense. In fact, talking of one of those centers, the Salem Center at UT does try to be very conscious of, giving both sides of the political spectrum some voice. We were just having a conversation around Ayn Rand, in fact, like a couple of weeks back. And so one of the panelists actually made a very similar point that public education makes very little sense, because as soon as you give the government free right to do anything, there's a monopoly, and monopolies are bad. So he made a very similar point. In fact, we did end up discussing your book as well for a while. So in light of that, and in light of the way you've seen education change, in the way you're sort of talking about the universities, how do you look at the rise of homeschooling as a concept? I remember we had a slight conversation when we met in Austin. Does homeschooling appeal to you? And especially if you look at the whole signaling model of education, where do you think homeschooling comes in, and can it be a viable alternative approach?
Yeah, so homeschooling definitely appeals to me. It appeals to me so much that I have done it. I homeschooled my older kids for grades 7 through 12. I homeschooled all of my 4 kids during COVID. And after the schools reopened, we gave our younger kids a choice. My daughter went back. My younger son stayed with me. So he's now done, let's see. So so I guess he's in his 5th year of homeschooling now. So anyway, definitely I am supportive of it as a general idea. I would never recommend it to everyone because it's not practical for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I would say it is practical for more people than are currently doing it. Especially parents that are putting a lot of time into their kids' education. I think there is a serious question of it might be easier to do it yourself, actually, because then you wouldn't have to worry about going and conforming to what the teacher wants. During COVID, I actually just said every parent should be homeschooling right now. Your kids don't get to have any friends at school anyway. Would you rather either be the enforcer for the regular teacher or just go and teach them yourself? It's easier to do it yourself, or was during COVID. Homeschooling was something that when I was 15 basically barely existed. It was still illegal in a bunch of places. Now it's legal in all 50 states with varying degrees of regulation. I'm in Virginia, where there's basically no regulation, which is, I think, the best policy. Couldn't something go wrong? Yes, of course something could go wrong.
Sure.
Something can go wrong with public school, but nevertheless, better to just take our chances with letting parents who actually love their kids do their best bet. And remember, the alternative is not perfect education. The alternative is doing what government says, which is terrible in its own way. Let's see. So in terms of signaling and homeschooling, this was my main worry. Just to back up. So probably many of your listeners don't know what signaling is. There's a big debate in the economics of education. Well, why does school pay? Not whether school pays, but why. The conventional story that people have been told from early ages is you go to school and you learn how to reading and writing, useful skills, and you need these skills to get a job in today's society. All right, so that's the general story, not completely wrong. The signaling story says, well, a lot of the reason is that schools certify you. Someone who has lots of fancy degrees, they've got stamps on the forehead saying, stamp, stamp, stamp. MIT PhD, hire this person. It's not actually they learned anything useful, but that they jumped through a lot of hoops and convinced people that they are worth hiring, that they've got high employability. Right now, once you have this view, which is my view, it's the core thesis, the case against education, it is natural to be very worried about homeschooling because, well, won't I be giving my kids the wrong stamps, which will prevent them from having a decent life in this unfortunate society? And so what I did is for middle school, I know something about the society. Like no one knows what you did in middle school. We can save the homeschool for middle school.
Sure.
There'll be no paper trail. No one will even know what happened. Once we were thinking about homeschooling my kids for high school, then I did get nervous. If you talk to homeschoolers, they'll just give you a bunch of happy, oh, everybody loves homeschoolers. No, they don't. Then I did try tracking down neutral researchers without a dog in the fight. And the normal answer they had is colleges probably have some moderate discrimination against homeschoolers, but if you use homeschooling to do something really impressive, you can easily more than compensate for that discrimination against homeschoolers. And so that's the way that I have handled the education of my high schoolers is we are going to go and do a bunch of standardized tests. We're going to do advanced placement tests. We're going to demonstrate to the world that we are not people who just sat around reading the Bible to each other, but really the people that are ready to go and excel in the real world. So that is what I did. And so at least for my first two homeschooled high schoolers, that worked out great. And hoping this will work out for my third one.
Okay, wonderful. Coming back, a quick follow-up to the question of when you mentioned if the parents love their children, they should just teach them instead of letting the government deal with the kids. Do you think, in addition to love, you would also need basics? So, I mean, how many kids can boast of their father being a world-class economist and his father's friends being people like Tyler Coe and Alex Tabarrok, right? That's like the 0.0001%. So if there are people who might love their kids, but they just lack the intellectual wherewithal, what would you recommend to those parents?
I mean, I would say that first of all is check your premises. Is it true that you don't know enough to go and teach sixth grade?
Okay.
Very few parents don't know enough to teach sixth grade. Like, well, how many grades did you finish? Maybe you've forgotten something. Like, if you wanted to, couldn't you just go back to the book and relearn it?
Yeah.
So I'd say that at least for younger grades, the idea that a parent wouldn't be intellectually competent to go and homeschool their kids is wrong.
Sure.
Once you're getting up to high school, then again, the question is not, are you actually good at the subjects, but are you a better teacher than the teacher that they would get in regular school? And that's where you remember a lot of teachers are really bad.
Sure.
Right. I would say the real issue with homeschooling has very little to do with subject matter knowledge and much more about patience. Some parents, their personality is such that they are just going to be unhappy doing it and they're going to make their kids unhappy. And then I'd say, look for other alternatives.
Sure.
Of course, also, I would say, try to get your temper under control. Like I said, my parents never really did that. And you can do it. With effort, you are fully capable of treating other people decently, even your own children.
Of course. Now, that's a good point. Do you think the idea behind homeschooling and just the core philosophy behind how you could teach your children at your home, that's a fairly first world concept? Again, I'm coming from the Indian perspective. Do you think this idea could be transplanted to, let's say, a third world or a semi-third world country?
Yeah, great question. Actually, so when I was in Mumbai, I got to hang out with a dad who was homeschooling his son because of my work.
Sure. Oh, nice.
Like, oh, wow. And he even said that it was one of my essays that convinced his wife, who's a PhD psychologist, to get on board. It's like, oh my God, I convinced somebody's wife. That doesn't happen very often. but anyway, what I would say is actually in countries where you still have low female labor force participation, then homeschooling is actually easier than in countries where women generally have jobs outside the home, because homeschooling is the kind of thing that is easy to combine with other sorts of childcare and home care.
Okay.
So I mean, now if you say, well, what if they're illiterate? Right? If they're illiterate, it's a different story.
Sure.
Right? Although worth pointing out, in countries where moms would be illiterate, it's also standard to have teachers that don't even show up to school.
Yes.
So I'd say maybe you're better off learning how to read and then teaching your kid than going and sending them to a school where the teacher doesn't show up. Also, my friends in India were telling me that it's very common to go and use private schools, which in terms of total cost to anybody are like 1/10 the cost of government schools. And yet those teachers do show up for the same reason that during COVID, private schools reopened. They don't get their money if the teachers don't show up.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I think especially talking from an Indian perspective, there are a lot of people for whom private school would be exorbitantly expensive, and they still would prefer to send their kids to private school over government school, precisely because teacher absentee rates are just so sky high in like a lot of government schools.
I mean, the nice thing about private schooling in a country like India is, well, think about this. If before you pay for private schooling in the US, you need to say, well, the private school has to be better in quality than the public school, because if I can get public school quality for free, there's no reason for me to pay to get anything less than that quality.
Yeah.
So if your public schools are of terrible quality, then all private schools really have to be of better quality than that in some important way. On the other hand, if your public schools are terrible, then a private school can compete that's really at a Walmart level of quality. Right.
No,
And
I think
that's what's going on in countries like India, is that you have very cheap bargain private education because it's still better than an empty classroom that you would get from the government. Whereas in the US, private education usually does cost quite a bit, because there'd be no point to give to give something that was cheap but lower quality in the public school, because the public school would still be the better option then.
Yeah, no, makes sense. And I think this also goes to the point of when we were discussing about governments trying to build monopolies and things which they shouldn't. In India, the government actually does a lot of bad work by making sure that private schools or private players are not able to enter the education space. And there's a big argument going on that if the government was to just step back and let the private players flourish, the market would just take care of good education. So, but we'll get to the India point in a bit. Going back to my point of being the nonconformist, when you mentioned your ideas around education, when you wrote the book and now, do you find that you're part of the mainstream, or do you think this ideology is still an outlierish ideology where the mainstream still very much supports public schooling, supports government subsidizing education?
Yeah, good question. Out of all the books that I have written, my book on education is one that I can present to a totally normal audience of Americans, and almost the whole audience is nodding their head in agreement for most of the talk.
Sure.
When I'm just describing what's really happening, then unless someone has a whole philosophy or dogma that they feel committed to, people can just say, yeah, like what you're saying accurately describes my firsthand experience in education for between 13 and 25 years.
Yeah.
So like very few people will ever just contradict me when I describe how education really works. The time when people start pushing back is when I say, therefore, let's cut government spending on education by a penny. And as soon as you want to take 1 penny away from education, then people lose their minds. And they start saying things that directly contradict what they were saying before. Like, yes, education is super wasteful. Well, let's cut the budget by a penny. That would be a total disaster. You just told me it was wasteful. So how could cutting a penny's worth of waste be a disaster? Well, because we shouldn't go and cut spending. We should reform it. All right. That, first of all, that does. You still need to admit that I was right and that you were wrong on saying it would be a disaster. But secondly, then it's like, well, what are the odds that the system will reform? I think it makes a lot more sense for a very dysfunctional system to say, we're cutting off your money, than to say the money keeps coming, but we want you to do better.
Yeah. Amazing. No, I was reading this book about thick and thin desires in mimesis. And I think the whole idea around that people should be going through the standard public school pipeline of education is a very thick desire. So
what desire?
Thick and thin desires. These are all.
Could you say that slowly?
Thick and thin.
Thick and thin. Thick and thin.
Thick and thin. So I think your ideas around you should probably start cutting public funding for public education if you agree with me that public schooling is not doing what it should. That somehow hits people's thick desires, and then that's a problem, and they don't sort of want to follow through. But this takes me to a point about just mainstream ideas once again. Now, you mentioned that The Case Against Education is a book which you can talk to in front of a completely normal layman audience, and people will understand the context. Similarly, for books like Build Baby Build or Open Books, they are graphic novels. So as an economist, you've also had this dual role of being an idea popularizer, right? People like Tyler Cowen in Marginal Revolution, people like Dr. Thaler with his books and things like that. How important do you see both of these roles for you, especially as a public intellectual, that you're not just supposed to be writing technical papers for that academic crowd, but also engaging with the real world?
Right. So here's the thing. If you do the kind of work where it can accomplish good in the world, even though hardly anyone's ever heard about it, then it's fine to just stick to very technical papers. So if it's something on like details of how to run a nuclear power plant, that knowledge only needs to be understood by a few thousand people to have great effects. On the other hand, if it's an idea about public policy, well, that's like especially a big idea. That's an idea where unless you go and get a lot of support for it and a much broader audience and communicate in a way that people understand, it will never do any good at all. So that's the way that I think about being a public intellectual is if you are working, so like there's no point in only working exclusively on technical issues. If the only way that it winds up mattering is if it gets to be larger than a technical audience. And the only thing you might say is, well, maybe there's specialization. Some people do the technical part and other people do the popularizing part. And for that, I would say, all right, that sounds good in principle, but does that actually happen?
Sure.
Quite rarely. And if you just look at most work in technical social science, it basically just stays where it lands in journals and then never goes anywhere. So yes, in my work, I try to work on issues that are important enough to actually change the world. And then that means I can't just do something technical. I've got to go and figure out a way to make technical ideas accessible and to show people why they really matter and why it might seem like it's a picky point, but it's actually really a big deal.
Okay.
Something else that I've done is to try to be the person that otherwise barely exists, which is someone who reads technical papers, tries to figure out if they're important, and then repackages them for a broader audience. So in a way, sometimes I am the person that I say barely exists, which is the person who transports technical ideas, repackages them, and sells them to a broader audience. Although more often I'm someone that is taking my own ideas and then bringing them to a larger audience.
Okay, but I was discussing the similar concept with Dr. John Hatfield, your friend, my professor at UT, and he did mention that a lot of times his work, which is super technical, super math dense, it's very difficult to make it accessible without dumbing it down. So I think this is a larger question of how is it that you're writing your books? Like, is there a very different Dr. Bryan Caplan when he's writing a Build Baby Build versus a Dr. Bryan Caplan who's writing a paper in economics? Are there different muscles in your head which you're exercising for both of these writings?
Yeah, so those are the two extremes. So academic journal writing, that is one where if you want to succeed, you really do have to be thinking about what will the referees say, what does the editor want to say. And honestly, that's why I basically stopped writing academic papers 11 years ago, because it's so constraining in terms of what topics are allowed, what arguments you're allowed to make, how general you can make it. Even the style of language, it's got to be a low quality style of writing generally. Like they will actually penalize you for having good quality writing. At the other end, I've got 2 graphic novels, which are the most accessible. Those are ones that can be easily read by even precocious children, while I think still being illuminating to people who are research specialists. In terms of my university press books, those are ones where I'm generally trying to have the audience range from what I call the good undergraduate. So good, someone who's an undergraduate who actually is curious and willing to put in some effort, all the way up again to research specialists. So for books like The Case Against Education, I don't imagine that any kids are going to read them. I don't imagine that it's going to be read by someone who isn't intellectually curious. Whereas Open Borders or Build Baby Build, those are ones where I've actually seen kids reading them. So it's like, all right, so a kid, not only is it possible, but kids find them interesting enough to actually go and read them. So that's what's going on.
So don't you think that for a topic like Open Borders, kids would prefer reading a book like The Case Against Education if that were to come out in a graphic novel format, much more than, let's say, Open Borders? So is that something on the plane?
So possibly, I'll admit I'm less motivated to go and just convert an existing book into a graphic novel than to do something from scratch. It's a good idea. If someone else wanted to do it, I would probably give them my blessing if I'd seen that they had done high quality work before. If I had infinite life, I would probably convert them all into graphic novels. But in some sense, for my lifetime accomplishments, I like having a mix of different kinds of books. So I don't regret that I did either in the format that I did. If I could go and make both and both at no cost, I would totally do that. But if I really have to go and do all the effort, then I'm probably not going to. I don't have the years. Years.
No, all of us believe you definitely have the years. We wish you have many more years.
Yes, well, I hope. But you got to see my list of projects. I got a long list, so most of them will never get done.
I'm not surprised at all. You do mention, I think in The Case Against Education, about your lifelong sequestration in the ivory tower with permanent residents of the ivory tower. So when you say something like, I take a principled stand against doing academic writing because I genuinely feel it doesn't achieve as much of the goals I want. Do you ever get flack from fellow academicians for having such a position?
So, I mean, honestly, I've never said I have a principled stand. What I have is a pragmatic stand. It's no longer valuable for me at my stage in my career. If I was talking to an assistant professor, I would say totally do like a bunch of very technical papers so that you can go and secure your future.
Yeah.
And if they were someone who says, yeah, but I want to be like me, and I said, well, I wasn't like me when I was at your stage in the career, in my career. I was trying to transition to doing things that are more interesting, but you've got to pay your dues. It's just an imperfect world.
Okay.
I mean, I do think that there is some value in writing a few academic papers just so you understand what academic papers are like and how good they really can be and how good they usually are, especially if you take a very close look at published ones and say, like these have some serious problems, or it seems solid on the surface, but then like there's a lot of math here, but then the math is all based upon a totally debatable assumption that was made for convenience or whatever.
Okay. Okay. Makes sense. Usually in the academic world, there is, as you mentioned, the incentive structure is very clear. It could very well be like a publish or perish scenario. Do you feel that when you stopped writing papers, the way fellow academicians were looking at you, how seriously you were being taken in those circles, did that come up or come down? Or did you just stop caring after, let's say, you got tenure?
I mean, here's what I would say. Based upon my academic publications alone, I don't think my status ever was very high in academia. It was at a level like, okay, well, this is like very good work and moving on with my life.
Okay.
So that's where I would say that I was in the eyes of most academics. I never got any notable praise from any of my classmates. I never got any emails from Princeton students saying, "Oh, like I'm really impressed by your latest paper." So I think I was always seen as there being something wrong or deficient with me by people at Princeton, for example. Now, along the way, as I started trying to branch out and do academic articles on more interesting questions, or questions that I saw as being of greater importance, I would say, like, I never again got normal academics to say, "Oh, this is really great work" or anything. Instead, I just started meeting more creative academics, people who had had mainstream success, but were still isolated and considered weird by their colleagues. And that's really what I transitioned to. Was I went from being considered, perhaps, competent by more famous economists, but competent, but in no way noteworthy, to moving into someone who is weird, but doing something that in the eyes of dissenting professors is interesting or important. And so I think what's happened is that at top schools, it's common for me to have like 2 or 3 people that really like me, and like off the record, in a perfect world, Bryan would be here and we would go and fire some of these boring colleagues that I have. But the truth is that I was not someone who had to make any major sacrifices, because I never had anything more than someone who was capable of getting tenure at a mid-tier school in terms of conventional publications. And there was never a time that I was getting schools saying, "Oh, we really want to go and hire you away from George Mason." Like even when I was publishing normal journals, there was the sense of Bryan is weird and these papers are good enough to publish, and yet he's not. Honestly, a lot of it was he's trying to go and do his own thing, and you're not supposed to do your own thing if you're an economist at George Mason. You're supposed to be going and adding another brick on the edifice of a building started by Ivy League people.
Yeah.
So put it this way: it's very common in an article to go and end with "further research is needed."
Sure.
The catch is that if you are a high status professor, then lower status people are supposed to go and do that stuff that you say should be done next. On the other hand, if you're a low status person, basically that stuff isn't actually meant to be done.
Sure.
Or maybe you don't even go and bother prescribing what should be done next because there aren't people that are looking up to you and saying it. And so basically, I wrote papers as if I was a high status person, where I would go and say, "I'm carving out a new area. This is what should happen next." And then crickets. No one goes and starts extending my work other than me.
Sure.
The number of papers that I had where I got the first paper in, all right, that's interesting. Then I tried to do a follow-up, and I think the reaction of the referees is, "Well, this is just following up on your own weird stuff. So we'll take 1 paper on this. We're not going to take 2.
Okay. So, and then that experiences like these is what got me to think of you as a nonconformist, especially in line with the piece you wrote on your mother. So
yeah, here's what I would say is I'm a nonconformist, but not a contrarian. So a contrarian is someone who just says the opposite of other people just to aggravate them.
Sure.
I honestly do not do that.
Yes.
I am a nonconformist, and like the word is precise. It just says you're not conforming. It doesn't say that you're trying to go and do the opposite. We do have another word for the opposite. That's antinomian. Someone who just finds out what other people hold sacred, and then you do the opposite. Yeah. I'm not like that. I have a lot of normal views. And furthermore, like I don't like upsetting anyone. Like, my dream is not that I own the X's, but like I really like to just change people's minds and be friends with everybody. That's my dream. I just like being at a big happy party of everyone saying, "Isn't this all great?" Yes, it is. That's the way I like the world to be.
That's the way to be. And so, talking of like big large parties, India. When you went to India, was that a big, large party?
It was a bunch of mid-sized parties anyway.
There you go.
I mean, so what's great about India, that, being the most populous country in the world, the most populous country in human history at this point, it means that you can go to a city where 1 in 500,000 people likes you, and you can still fill a room. And so that's what I saw. So, packed room packed office in Mumbai that I got to speak to. So that was super fun. My friend Sachin went and organized everything and got us the space and toured me around.
Yeah,
that was great. And then when I was in Delhi, I was at the Montpelier Society meeting. So there were hundreds of people there. Of course, not just to see me, but I got to go and speak to a few audiences there. And then afterwards, there were a couple of other talks that I got to give. Got to give a talk to Trustbridge, give a talk to the Civil Society Center, I believe.
Yeah.
It's the
Center for Civil Society.
Yeah, Center for Civil Society. Yeah. And then like even on a side trip to Amritsar, I had 2 people who knew me from the internet who volunteered to go and fly with me.
Yeah.
So basically there was not a day that I was alone in India. So that was really cool.
Yeah, pretty much.
Country packed with great people and terrible policy.
No, completely agree. You mentioned about how the beggars sort of startled you. And of course, for someone coming from the first world, the level of sub-Saharan level poverty in India can be absolutely shocking.
I mean, most people said, I was never actually got to the sub-Saharan poverty level of India or parts of India. I was told they exist.
Yeah, they absolutely.
Mumbai and Delhi are nowhere near the poorest parts of India, right?
Pretty sure. I mean, there might be certain slum areas in Bombay, in Maharashtra rather, not Bombay precisely, but when you go to, let's say, the state I come from, UP, the certain village parts in UP or tribal areas.
Right? Uttar Pradesh, right?
Uttar Pradesh, there you go. So that could be really shocking in terms of how poor this is. But there's another side of India. So the classic adage for India, which I think our first prime minister said, that India is this country where everything you say true about India, the opposite is also true. And we are like occupying 3 centuries at the same time. There's one leg of India in the 21st century. There's one in 20th and one in 19th.
Yeah.
So when you talk of like a lot of inequality in the country, and then you also talk about this crippling poverty, for a country trying to battle both, don't you think, like, how should a country look at this? Have countries in the past grown rich while also becoming less unequal? Or is it always a sequential thing that you first become rich, then you sort of try and become more equal?
Well, let's see. So, I mean, that is an idea that's been around. I think the truth is that inequality is just a terrible measure, which can mean a lot of different things. Inequality can be North Korean inequality, where the government goes and controls controls everything, and the leaders just go and take the good stuff for themselves and leave the rest of the people in poverty. It can, on the other hand, it can be allowing incredible entrepreneurs to go and start companies and do a lot better. So, I would say that the idea that economic growth and the elimination of poverty go hand in hand, that's totally true, right? Overall, I would just say that, like saying whether inequality is good or bad is just a silly question. It's rather makes sense to focus on why is there inequality? If it's inequality from some people are contributing more, then I'd say, like, don't worry about that.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, if it's inequality from people in government going and starving the rest of the population, then worry about that a lot. And that may be a very good point to go and weaponize the rhetoric of inequality while realizing that that's not the central problem. So in my book, Build, Baby, Build, I talk a lot about how housing regulation is race inequality. And if we had a free market, inequality would be lower. And that's all true.
Yeah.
But, like the real issue is not so much the inequality, but rather that government is strangling this industry that is so vital for people, rich and poor alike.
Yes. No, completely agree. And I think Dr. Caplan just given how much you've published across your blogs and books and everything and the talks you've had, I feel we could go on talking for the next 10 hours and we'd still be just scratching the surface of, all that brilliant work that you've done. But since we are right on time.
It.
Yeah, of course.
It, yes. So, you are also smart and cool, Pranjal.
Love that. So, but as we sort of come right on the time, I would love to end with my final question.
Okay.
You talked about fantasy, your varied interests in literature and things like that. So for the listeners and for me, recommend books, music, movies, which sort of mean a lot to you and you would want everyone to check it out.
All right. So like I am, as you gather, I still am a big fan of Ayn Rand's novels, but what's worth knowing is she is part of a great tradition of Russian philosophical novelists. And just purely as a novelist, I'll say that Tolstoy is better than her. I think she's very good, but I am a huge fan of Tolstoy. I would probably start with Anna Karenina and then move to War and Peace. But these are just fantastic books where just to read them carefully is extremely rewarding. I've read both of those at least 3 times. And just the patience of Tolstoy for understanding different kinds of human beings. Let's see, in terms of graphic novels, my favorite series remains Sin City, 2 movies, very faithful adaptations, but I would still go and read those books. Also a big fan of Larry Gonick's Cartoon History of the Universe series. That stuff is great. In terms of music, so, it's more idiosyncratic. When I was young, I got super into classical and opera. I'm a really big fan of this obscure classic opera, or like historical opera recording series called Lebendige Vergangenheit, so German for living memories, and so Lebendige Vergangenheit. So I was starting now, there's 500 discs in the series are all on YouTube now. Lately I've actually been much more into heavy metal. So my big, the band that I didn't, a lot of it is just coming to love bands that I knew existed when I was young, but didn't listen to them. So Dio especially, but
good choice. You're starting out strong.
Out of bands that I only learned about. So I'm a huge fan of Hailstorm. So
good choice. Yes,
he's awesome. Oh, Hailstorm.
Yes.
All right.
So I learned about a lot of these musics from my father. My father is a big metal head. So Dio,
metalhead. All right, yeah. That's hard for me to wrap my mind around. But then again, I'm somebody's dad, and I'm a metalhead. So
there you go. In fact, just last year when my father was visiting, I took him to this concert in California. It was supposed to be AC/DC's return concert.
Yep.
So it was called Power Trip. So I got a chance to listen to AC/DC. Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Metallica, a bunch of great things. So yeah, complete metalhead.
All right. So in that case, when you're my age, you need to get into opera.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So that was music. Now, any movies? Are you a big movie person?
Yes, I am a big movie person. Let's see. Movie posters on the walls of the movie theater in my house. I've got, Lord of the Rings, Kill Bill, Moulin Rouge, 21 Grams. 21 Grams is probably the one that people are least likely to know. That's Iñárritu's second movie, first movie in English. Also a big fan of his, Amores Perros. Modern people are more likely to know him from The Revenant, Birdman, but I actually think those first 2 movies are his best. Let's see. Farewell, My Concubine. That one's great history of China and Chinese opera all in one. Life is Beautiful. It's the one movie where I always cry at the end. It's just so good. And as a father, even more powerful for me now. Let's see. And then, so Tarantino. Love basically every minute of every Tarantino movie. So hard for him to go wrong in my book.
Oh, absolutely. I'll of course link all of these in the show notes so that if people want to dive into those rabbit holes, they absolutely can. I discovered you through one of these rabbit holes. I hope people can discover much more through this conversation.
Okay.
I think this was an absolutely enlightening 1 hour. Dr. Caplan, thank you so much for your time. You were super generous.
Totally,
Absolutely, and hoping this is one of the first many future conversations. May you keep writing a lot of books, and maybe keep talking like this again.
All right, sounds good. So I'll be back in Austin for NatalCon in March.
And when you are here, we will be meeting.
All right, sounds good. All right, great talking to you, Pranjal.
Absolutely, great talking to you, Dr. Caplan. Thank you.
Great luck with the podcast. Like, I'll spread a sprinkle Dorkesh pixie dust on it and see if we can make this happen.
Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.